I guess one could say, how do we know that evolution is happening anyway? So here are some evidence that we have for evolution and common ancestry. The truth is that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. The main sources are the fossil record, and then we also have this comparative morphology we'll talk about, and then of course biogeography. So let's talk about the fossil record. Fossils, those are remains or traces of past organisms. And the fossil record basically gives us this visual of evolutionary change over time. And it can be dated by examining the rate of carbon 14 decay and the age of the rocks where the fossils were actually found. So this gives us like a geographical data for that organism in addition to their age. Comparative morphology is just what I find completely fascinating. This is an analysis of the structures of living and extinct organisms and, of course, compares them. So, homology are the characteristics in related species that have similarities, even if their functions are different. We can have embryonic homology, which is when species have similar embryonic development structures, and then vestigial structures. Then these are phenotypic displays or structures that are conserved even though they no longer have any sort of use for them, but they are retained in an organism. So an example would be like the tailbone and an appendix in humans. Those are things that we still have. We have the proteins synthesis for, the DNA coding for, but we no longer need those things any longer. Molecular homology, many species share this similar DNA amino acid sequencing, and so this is nothing new. We know that molecular homology exists, and it's a way to compare species relative common ancestor. This homologous structure and comparative morphology is fascinating. Look at the limb of a frog, a lizard, a bird, a whale, a man, a cat. You can see how the characteristics between all of them, they're very, very similar, and that's because we share a common ancestor. Even a lot of the bones are still named the same. They're the same anatomy. Now they do all function differently, right? The frog hops, if the bat flies, the bird flies, the whale swims, and the dog walks. Comparative morphology can follow a series of evolutionary patterns. Convergent evolution is a similar adaptation that it means that they have evolved in distantly related organisms just due to similar environments. So these things we see as comparative morphology. We also see analogous structures. These are structures that are similar, but they have separate evolutionary origins. For example, the wing in birds versus bats versus bees. Like each of these species, they have wings, yes, but the wings did not originate from a common ancestor. Bats and bees are not related, even though they have a similar structure that functions, very almost identically. These analogous structures are just examples of convergent evolution, where these similar adaptations have evolved even in these distantly related organisms due to this similar environment. Structural evidence indicates common ancestry in almost all eukaryotes. There's many fundamental and cellular features in organism cellular processes that are conserved and displayed across all sets of organisms. These are things like membrane-bound organelles, even this linear chromosome feature, even these intron regions in genes. These are just sequences that show up in all cellular DNA that has nothing to do necessarily with coding for a protein in that particular organism, but there are similar sequence patterns that just show up across lineage. Biogeography is the distribution of animals and plants just geographically. We can see species on the oceanic islands that resemble mainland species, and we can see species on the same continent that are similar, even though there's a distinct form of species on other continents. This biogeography is just a distribution of how plants and animals can geographically have similar features. Let's just do a quick check here to see if you're understanding the vocabulary and you're understanding the hierarchy that the vocabulary serves. What type of data provides evidence for evolution? We can see fossil data, we can see biogeographical data, and we can see morphology. In terms of natural selection, how can structures become vestigial? Really, a structure has been useful like before at a previous time in that particular individual, or I'm sorry, that population's evolutionary history. But it may have had some sort of mutation that basically rendered it useless, and therefore it can be observed across generations, but it was neither selected against nor selected before, so it was just conserved in the genetic material of that population. So when we sum all of this up, we see that populations continue to change and evolve, and genomes change, like antibiotic resistance in bacteria. We can also see this genome change in insect resistance when it comes to pesticides, and we can also see pathogens that cause these new emerging diseases that we've never seen before.